This is my favorite moment in Dark Souls. Not a climactic boss fight, not an awe-inspiring cutscene, and not even some haunting, heartbreaking bit of visual storytelling. Just standing high on a narrow catwalk between swinging axe blades with a yawning abyss looming beneath me. But before we dive into why I find this specific sequence to be so special, let's zoom out and examine this area, Sen's Fortress, as a whole, and why I believe it's not only the best area in the entire game, but why it's also a perfect microcosm of the immensely rewarding and unforgettable experience that is Dark Souls. Unlike most of my favorite areas in the Soulsborne series, Sen's Fortress isn't dripping with grim atmosphere or littered with small stories of harrowing tragedy, and it doesn't even offer anything particularly relevant from a lore perspective. It is, however, a very challenging level that quite literally gatekeeps the player from the rest of the game. It functions as a brutal gauntlet filled with precarious platforms, arduous obstacles, and sinister snake men that all serve a single purpose: stopping you from progressing. Sen's Fortress is Dark Souls at its most directly antagonistic. It's very clear that this area is designed only to impede and kill you in as many delightfully depraved ways as possible, and that's made clear from the player's very first step into the fortress. A pressure plate at the entrance activates a dart trap that will knock huge chunks off the player's health bar, which encourages players to look out for similar tiles found later in the level. This obstacle is easily avoided once the player is aware of it, and as with nearly every hazard in Sen's Fortress, can be turned against the enemies to efficiently dispatch them. Even this room, which contains the game's first encounter with a mimic, is detectable based on the orientation of the mimic's chain, its slight breathing, and its unusual placement at an odd angle in the center of the room. The elevator just past it, which will ram the player into a bed of spikes if they stand on it for too long, is clearly signposted as being dangerous by the enormous bloodstain coating the platform. I'd argue that these two traps are the most difficult to detect in the area, but still, every hurdle the player must overcome in Sen's Fortress is perfectly manageable as long as the player is observant and persistent enough, and every death the player incurs brings them one step closer to understanding and progressing through the level. Take the boulder trap, as it requires fairly precise timing to run past unscathed. However, once progressing far enough into the fortress, the boulder trap can be reoriented to the player's advantage, either knocking over enemies in a manner that would make any slapstick comedian proud, or smashing through walls to allow access to new items, characters, and paths of progression. If there's any one philosophy of Sen's Fortress that you'll have to adopt as a player, it's turning your disadvantages into advantages, which is a fairly appropriate philosophy for the entire game of Dark Souls as well. Despite being one of the more challenging areas in the game, I'd argue that Sen's Fortress is much more challenging from a psychological perspective than it is from a physical one. Dark Souls has the audacity to expect me to cross this catwalk while lethal pendulums lurch past me, and enemies shoot ranged lightning attacks at me, and other enemies block my path? Come on. The incremental increase in difficulty of the level geometry itself with each new floor of the fortress is daunting without a doubt, but the key to beating Sen's Fortress is recognizing that most of the difficulty is merely in your head. The axes swing slowly enough that you can easily run or even jog past them as long as you don't get greedy, and that once paralyzing fear of being launched off of the platform suddenly becomes laughable. And speaking of being launched off the platform, the level design of the area is incredibly vertical, not only in how the player ascends from one increasingly hazardous ledge to the next, but also in how the player can plunge into the muck below if they're knocked from one of these ledges. Rather than having the player automatically fall to their demise, which could have felt too punishing even for Dark Souls, the player has a chance to survive this fall into the very bottom of this serpent's den. While the player's odds still aren't that great, as the filth that's accumulated and congealed at the bottom of the structure will slow the players significantly unless they're wearing a specific ring, the consequences of falling into this layer of the fortress aren't entirely negative, as there are new foes to battle, new items to discover, and new areas to explore and connect to. The player may even choose to descend into these depths on their own accord, which offers a relatively safer method of traversal, although that won't necessarily save you from the monstrous Titanite demons that await you below. The inclusion of this basement area also creates a much more believable physical space, given that you can see all the way down to the very foundations of this structure. Which brings us back to the start of the video, when you've crossed every precarious walkway and conquered every challenge in the fortress. As you stand calmly between these swaying blades of death where a single step in the wrong direction could lead to your demise, you glance beneath you and realize how far you've come. Being able to peer into the depths of the fortress from this angle and recognize every ledge you crossed and every trap you overcame is a perfect visual representation of your progress as a player. There's no dialogue, no fanfare, and no character that congratulates you on coming this far. To see how much you've grown as a player in such a short amount of time, all you need to do is look down. I think it's that ever-present sign of progress in Sen's Fortress that pushed me to complete the level on my first playthrough. As daunting, brutal, and unforgiving as the area is, my growth, however incremental, was always noticeable, as being able to push past the first bridge just that little bit easier than the previous attempt silently encouraged me to keep battling forward. Eventually, I stopped dreading the gauntlet of ludicrous traps and pitfalls that awaited me, and I started to relish that challenge. It wasn't until I had conquered Sen's Fortress that I knew that I loved Dark Souls, and the accompanying cycle of pain and self-improvement that came with it. Amazingly, we've only covered the interior of the fortress up to this point, as proceeding past this staircase leads the player outside to the upper section of the structure. Here, enslaved giants will hurl exploding boulders at you as you make a mad dash further upwards still. Plenty of other secrets are stashed about, including paths to these giants, valuable items, a semi-hidden bonfire that I didn't know about until I had beaten the game 4 times, and a shortcut right before the boss that leads back to the start of the level. Like every area in Dark Souls, Sen's Fortress rewards the player's exploration while still making that exploration feel daunting and trepidatious, incentivizing the player to search every nook and cranny of the fortress at their own peril. For example, running and leaping across this shattered walkway will lead the player to the Crestfallen Merchant, a broken man who not only sells the player useful items and equipment, but also offers an extremely cynical outlook on the player's odds of success.
Let me give you a nibble of advice. Don't even consider visiting Anor Londo. Not in your state. For a century they've tried and failed. The Night King Rendell, Black Iron Tarkus, and even Logan himself. You won't stand a chance, you'll be eaten alive. But go along if you wish, if only to deepen your despair.
If so many legendary figures have tried to conquer the fortress and have failed, what chances do you, a nobody, have? While this may seem discouraging on the surface, it makes your eventual victory against the boss at the end of the area all the more significant and empowering. While that boss, the Iron Golem, is a fun fight, the golem itself is quite literally a pushover. Defeating this foe will lift the player into the sunlit realm of the gods, Anor Londo. And in addition to being an outstanding area in its own right, Sen's Fortress prepares the player incredibly well for the area that comes next. An area that I plan on covering on the channel at some point in the future, as it also has an argument for being the best in the game. Anor Londo's primary defenders are the Silver Knights, enemies that are handled much easier when they're parried and backstabbed. The same holds true for the primary defenders of Sen's Fortress, the Snake Men, who can similarly be parried and backstabbed to largely trivialize their challenge. Even the ridiculously narrow rafters that the player must cross to traverse Anor Londo are just a step up from the walkways the player must cross in Sen's Fortress, meaning that the fairly high difficulty of these two sections remains natural in their progression. To me, Sen's Fortress is the perfect microcosm of the Dark Souls experience. It's a challenge that seems impossible at first glance, a challenge that demands a lot from the player in order to overcome it, and a challenge that is all worth it in the end given its material and emotional rewards. Like so many other locations in the game, Sen's Fortress has unlockable shortcuts and looping level design, a surprising amount of verticality, and architecture that is as hostile to the player as the enemies themselves are. I think what separates Sen's Fortress from the other areas in the game, though, is its singular focus on gameplay and on the challenge of ascending the fortress. It's not that bits of lore and environmental storytelling are absent from this area, because that certainly isn't the case if you look closely enough. Rather, it's that this area subtly communicates the player's progression so effectively. Breezing past the obstacles that once resulted in so many of your deaths is an immensely satisfying experience, and no area in Dark Souls rewards the player as clearly for their own willpower and perseverance. That feeling of climbing upwards is mental as well as physical, and that ability to affect the player so directly, to push them further and further towards achieving their goal even as they're knocked down again and again from reaching it, that's what makes Sen's Fortress so special. Hey guys, thank you so much for watching. It's always a pleasure to talk about Dark Souls 1, as no matter how many times I experience it, there's always something new that I learn and appreciate about it, which speaks to the overall quality of the game and the attention to detail that was put into it. Liking, subscribing, and sharing the video is appreciated as always, and I'm excited to dig into more of From Software's games in the very near future. Until then, stay safe, take care of each other, and don't you dare go hollow.